I'm an economist. I'm not a conservation biologist or a specialist in your topic of integrative conservation. Uh, but I am working with the United Nations actively every day to try to implement the globally agreed goals that we have set for sustainable development. So I'm constantly wondering about and worrying about how we can actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. Now, the basic problem is that our institutional framework, our politics and our economic institutions are not aligned with sustainable development. They are not aligned with conservation. They are not aligned with stabilizing the climate. They are not aligned with protecting biodiversity. So we are in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has been underway for many decades. It's already more than 30 years since the world governments adopted three major environmental agreements. The first on climate change, the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And these were adopted back in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We are more than 30 years later, and not one of these treaties is actually being implemented successfully. The reasons are complex, but the basic problem is that the international market economy and our geopolitical environment, the way that governments interact, does not lead to success so far. Time is also very short, because when we're dealing with biological conservation or climate change, it's not only a matter of delay, it's a matter of irreversibilities that we are facing. If we drive species to extinction, as far as we know, we're not going to recover them. If we exceed climate limits, we are not easily going to recover a safe climate. In both circumstances of ecosystem functioning and of the climate, and they're obviously related, we believe that there are tipping points beyond which we experience highly dangerous feedback effects and runaway effects that become irreversible. So when I say that we have lost time during the last 30 years, it's not merely that we have delayed the introduction of effective measures. We have also come closer to major irreversibilities. In the case of biological diversity, these irreversibilities include species extinction and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. When it comes to climate change, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we have already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will probably exceed the 1.5 degrees limit in 2024. Now, partly this is because of a short-term or interannual effect of El Nino, but the underlying upward trend of global warming has definitely accelerated. And we are now at a warming rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees, perhaps very seriously. And that could lead to irreversible disasters. The destruction of the ice sheets, or at least part of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, the slowing or even stopping of the ocean circulation, the thermohaline circulation, the melting of permafrost, and the massive release of methane and CO2 buried beneath the permafrost, and of course the loss of species that cannot migrate successfully in the context of a warming climate and which reach thermal limits beyond which they can't survive. And that's true of both plants and animals, and many alpine species which have been climbing up the mountainsides, but the mountains have peaks, and beyond that, the warming will lead to the destruction of the habitat of these species. In general, the world market economy does not send the right signals either for climate change or for biodiversity conservation. Markets do not incorporate the losses of natural capital in any direct way. These are, from an economic theory point of view, external effects that are not captured by market forces. And as much as we have discussed for the last 40 years, actually, these external effects, we have not succeeded in internalizing them or bringing them under control. Now, when it comes to biological diversity, I would say the challenge is even more complicated than the climate challenge. When it comes to the climate challenge, which includes the land use regulations, there is at least a pathway that can be identified for how the world's energy systems can be transformed in order to stop the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel use. And when it comes to the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at least a sketch of what needs to be done. When it comes to biological diversity, I would say that every biome, every ecosystem, every local land use environment presents its own challenges, which are very complex, which do not lend themselves to easy market-based solutions where one simply adjusts a market price, for example, and thereby creates an incentive that leads to the right outcomes. Because when we're talking about biological diversity, it's very hard to put a price on biological diversity. We don't easily correct the market failures that lead to the destruction of species and lead to the destruction of the functioning of the ecosystems. So when it comes to what to do, the challenges of biological conservation are extraordinarily complex. They cannot easily be summarized in the way that the climate agenda can be summarized. With the climate agenda, well, even there, of course, it's complex, but with the climate agenda, we say things like decarbonize the energy system by 2050, or reach net zero emissions by 2050. When we discuss the same issues with regard to biological diversity, we say protect a certain amount of land area, or stop or slow the destruction of habitat, or the extinction rates, and so on. But these are goals that are not easily turned into policies with effect. And so my own observation of these processes that I've been involved in a diplomatic level for the last 25 years on a daily basis is that both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda are complicated, But I would say the biodiversity agenda is even more complicated and less successful in terms of any kind of public awareness, set of policies, or measures of implementation. I think it's right to say we are on a path that is designed typically in the relevant species or the number of members of species, so the species abundance is in decline, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forests or whether it's different classes of species, amphibians or pollinators or other groups. And we do not have effective mechanisms to address this decline that are actually working and operational. So what to do? My own approach, which I advocate for all issues, and I should say that when it comes to sustainable development, we're talking about not only the environmental crises, but also the social crises, the economic crises, the problems of extreme poverty. We have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, after all. We have the climate crisis and so forth. My own view is that we need much more detailed specification of our objectives, of the ways to achieve them, and of their incorporation into national plans on a scientific basis. And then the identification of the policy instruments, whether it is economic incentives, regulation, land use, protected areas, and so forth, for how the scientifically specified objectives can be achieved, and then a systematic and frequent monitoring mechanism so that we are not simply meeting every 5 or 10 years to understand how bad things are going, but actually reporting almost in real time using extensive satellite data and ground truthing data so that we have a rapid feedback of data to confirm or disconfirm whether we are on the right track, and to enable not only monitoring and understanding the state of affairs, but also enforcement mechanisms that typically mean enforcement against illegal actions like illegal fishing or illegal clearing of forests or illegal use of scarce fresh water supplies and so forth. So planning, incentive structures, and monitoring mechanisms are all essential. I know that in a sense this exists in the area of biological diversity because the Kunming-Montreal Protocol is supposed to do this, but it is extremely weak. I can go an entire year without hearing one policymaker or one ambassador or one finance minister even mention the Convention on Biological Diversity, much less discuss how it is being enforced or implemented or incentivized. I hear almost nothing about this agenda at the UN or among policy makers. So you are the scientists and the experts, but I can tell you it is not in the active domain of the policy community. Now, I do also need to stress that even the climate agenda, which is much more visible, is also not being implemented because, well, it raises a number of questions, which I'll mention briefly. But the biodiversity agenda is way down on the list of awareness, of priority, of budgets, and of specific mechanisms for implementation. And it's more complicated because there aren't simple rules of what to do. These policies need to be implemented with a tremendous local knowledge everywhere. So only local ecologists can save their own local ecosystems because outsiders don't know, don't care, and are not in a position to set policies and plans for success. One more basic point that I want to emphasize, and then I'll talk about a couple of the obstacles, and then we can open it up for discussion. Whether it is the climate agenda or whether it is the biodiversity agenda, regional cooperation between neighboring countries is typically essential. And everything that I've said about how hard this is involves another level of difficulty, which is active cooperation among neighboring countries. Governments do not work very well together in a detailed way on just about anything, but in the areas of shared biomes, a shared river system, a shared forestry, a shared fisheries, cooperation sometimes exists on paper, but in practice, it's quite limited. Usually in a rivershed, the upstream countries do what they want, and the downstream countries try to adjust to the consequences. When it comes to fisheries, the illegal fishing is pervasive. Fleets come in and they hope to avoid detection. They catch the fish and they leave, but enforcement is very weak. When it comes to shared forest regions, it is very hard to get agreements on a shared forest biome to limit deforestation or logging, especially of highly valued tropical forest products. And so regional cooperation is both vital and difficult. This is true also in the climate area on energy transformation. In general, a low carbon energy system requires interconnections across national borders because when it comes to intermittent energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro, it's better to connect those in a large grid to reduce the variability by smoothing across a number of different sources rather than having one country at a time make its own energy system. But getting that kind of regional grid requires a lot of political trust, a lot of market organization, a lot of shared regulation, and so on. All of this is made complicated by our geopolitical environment. The United States is a very bad behavior, in my view, right now. The US government is more interested in its power, its military advantage, its dominance, than it is in sustainable development. I almost never hear a constructive word coming out of Washington about these topics. The only thing Washington is interested in is war, the military, and competition with China and competition with Russia. And this is all extremely short-sighted and dangerous and nasty, I have to say. So the geopolitical environment is also extremely difficult. Now, finally, let me just say what a world should be doing. And when it comes to land use and biodiversity, let me emphasize a very basic point, which you know, which is that sustainable management of ecosystems is critical both for the climate goals as well as for the biodiversity goals, because around 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, deforestation, and unsustainable forms of agriculture. And so this means that if we're going to address the climate agenda, we intrinsically need to address the conservation agenda. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect the ecosystem functions because they not only contribute directly to the biodiversity objectives, but they also contribute to the climate objectives. And of course, they're fundamental for many other objectives as well, for public health, for example, for access to safe water supplies and so on. So this agenda of sustainable land use, conservation, and ecosystem protection is a pervasive objective, but it is a difficult one. It's difficult scientifically, and it's very difficult to implement. The first thing that I have always wanted to see is a rigorous approach to land use planning that satisfies the needs of biological diversity conservation. My guru was the wonderful scientist Edward Wilson, who was a teacher of mine and a friend and a colleague. And he said, protect half the earth. And I always wanted to know which half. Where do we draw the lines? How do we determine this? For each country, can we show on a map where agriculture and cities can be and where the protected areas should be designated? I want the scientists to help us understand this. This obviously intersects very closely with the agriculture challenges. So ecologists and agronomists need to be working intimately together because the biggest challenge to biodiversity is probably the agriculture sector. It's the extension of farmlands, croplands, pasture lands. It's the drainage of water for irrigation. Agriculture is the great driver of land use change and of unsustainability and biodiversity loss. And yet the agronomists and the conservationists tend to view each other as enemies rather than as colleagues for how to actually draw the right maps to say, here's what can be done here and here's what should not be done here. Now, suppose we had an ideal map of the world that identified where the reserves should be, where agriculture should be under different conditions, how the rivershed should be used, how the fisheries should be controlled, and so forth. Suppose we knew that by the magic of ecological sciences, we would then face the question, how could such a vision actually be implemented? Because it would not be consistent with market forces. Market forces would say, chop down those trees and grow palm oil, deforest and open up more pasture land, and so forth. So the incentive questions become very crucial. Once we know what to protect, then we need a structure how to protect them. Let me just observe that we do not have even a basic incentive structure for conservation almost anywhere in the world. There is almost no active valuation of ecosystem services. There is no funding to keep forests standing. There is very little enforcement of mechanisms like tradable quotas for fisheries. Forests are routinely chopped down, even when they are designated as reserved areas, because illegal logging is quite profitable typically. I was taken a few years ago in Borneo, in Kalimantan, to a protected region, and all I saw for 50 kilometers was trucks carrying out giant tropical logwoods on their way to the Chinese market. So it was completely being deforested, but in name, it was a protected area. So we need incentive structures and enforcement structures that don't exist. There are basically, there are several kinds of tools that in principle could be used. We could be paying communities to protect the nature, even paying indigenous communities, for example, to be active stewards and guardians of their ecosystems. We could be paying to keep land areas intact rather than utilized. But the funding for that barely exists at the international level in any scale. So we have demonstration projects, small scale projects, but we don't have anything like the scale of resources that would be needed for this kind of protection. Another kind of regulation is to enforce rules of sustainability within global supply chains. So a buyer of tropical logwoods would have to certify that the source of those logs is a sustainable source, or the purchaser of soybeans from Brazil would have to certify that the soybeans did not come from a deforested margin of the Amazon, and so forth. And Europe is trying to introduce such supply chain rules. They're very rudimentary, and most of the supply side countries, whether it's the Southeast Asian countries that provide palm oil, or whether it is the South American countries that provide feed grains and meat products, resist this kind of regulation. They don't want it, they don't like it. And so really implementing this kind of sustainable supply chain rule, I think, is promising, but very difficult. Then comes the enforcement issue. Almost any of these mechanisms is subject to cheating and subject to illegal activities. And in order to enforce such agreements, there needs to be policing, and there needs to be very active monitoring. I think one of the most important good points is that with satellite data, we can have daily monitoring. In fact, we can create real-time data on where deforestation is taking place, or where ships are where they should not be in fishery zones, and so on. So we have the capacity for monitoring that is much, much greater than it was ever before, because it can be done remotely and digitally. But still, we haven't implemented such systems in a detailed way. So maybe I'll pause here just to say we're running out of time. We need the scientists to say, here is what to do. Here are the rules that could actually be put in place. Then economists like myself can probably help by coming along and saying, here are incentive structures or regulations or financial mechanisms that can help to enforce what you, the conservation biologists, have identified as the substantive need in order to achieve the conservation goals that the world has set. Then, of course, we have the ultimate issue of trying to get the attention of our governments. For me in the United States, this is especially hard because my government is especially nasty, I would say, incompetent and corrupt. And so it's rather difficult to get their attention because they're much more interested in war than they are in peace. and they're much more interested in unilateralism than they are in cooperation, but we have to try. So this is maybe where I'll stop and turn it back over to you for discussion.